I remember when I first started my channel, I had a priesthood leader who tried to advise me to stop, that if you do this, you're going to leave the church and lose your testimony. And I understood his concerns, particularly about what happened to me in the past, but I was like, I don't think telling people don't research is the answer. And I said to him, I was like, look, I'm going to be very careful. I'm going to try my best to look at the faithful scholarship equally, if not more.
Welcome, Murph.
Thank you.
And well, let's get right to it.
Perfect.
Uh, so Mormonism with the Murph. Last time we talked, you mentioned how you went through a faith crisis, how you left the church, how you came back, and how did that inspire you to start a YouTube channel?
Yeah. So over the year before me starting my YouTube channel, I was training to be a teacher. I was doing what's called a PGCE, which was a very demanding year. It was a lot of work becoming a trainee teacher, and I'd sort of like stopped, praying, reading scriptures as much. I was listening to podcasts again, and I started watching the LDS discussion series. Don't know if you've seen or heard of it on Mormon Stories. And I think that started around March or February 2022. And I'm very interested in truth claims, and I'm still open to listening to what critics have to say. And listening to that, there wasn't much new in there. I think some of the criticisms in the biblical scholarship section, like Deutero Isaiah and the Tower of Babel, some of those were maybe newer criticisms that weren't a big part of my initial faith crisis. But I thought it was just quite a good synthesis of the main criticisms, against the church. And I thought they were arguing it quite well. And every episode I watched, I found it just like, it was like I was in a boxing ring and I was like just getting like butt punched, hit with, problems and criticisms against. And I was struggling to, at that time, like have answers to defend or refute. And also, I was having more family members, friends who were going through a faith crisis or who had left the church. And I was having a lot of them, go to me because they knew I came back to the church and expressing a lot of their concerns, issues. And I saw the same ones that I had leaving. And I tried my best to, validate when I thought they were sharing, a fair criticism, maybe trying to provide nuance or like this might be the apologetic reconciliation. But I felt in those discussions that I didn't have great answers, despite having watched like different, channels like Saints Unscripted, Larry Saints Q&A, LDS Truth Claims. I'd read like Rough Stone Rolling, and I sort of felt like I just didn't have the adequate resources, and I felt again like I was being compounded with doubt, unbelief, and it was almost like, oh, like did the truth claims hold up? And I was very close around the end of June, July, to leaving the church again, thinking that I don't know if I can make this work, that unbelief's growing. But I had an idea as soon as my teacher training ended to start a YouTube channel that tried to be balanced, because I noticed that when I went to, critical podcasts or critical places, they were just presenting all the information evidence against. And remember some of the positive evidences I like highlighted to you in the last episode, like the Book of Enoch, ancient temple rites, old world geography, restoring Christianity or the primary statements of the witnesses. I felt like a lot of critics don't really deal with a lot of the positive evidence, and vice versa. Some of the best critical arguments I wasn't seeing the apologists really steel man or really dealing with, at least what I was seeing. And I kind of want to do my best to like bridge them together. And ultimately, I kind of want to figure some things out. Like, if the church isn't what it claims to be, then like that's fine. I want to know, but I want to look at the evidence on both sides. I want to look at the arguments on both sides. And we did a debate week at school. Uh, it was the last couple of weeks as a trainee teacher, and we did a debate week, and we talked about like how debate is all about looking at like, you got the four people who are for something trying to defend it, looking at the arguments and evidence to support it, and then those who are against, and how you want to try to be balanced. And that sort of prompted me that I should try to do something that's a bit like that, like because I'm not seeing too many channels that are, in my view, balanced. So that sort of was what a few things, my own faith journey, my own faith crisis and doubts, other people around me having some issues, wanting there to be a place that, is willing to talk to both sides and to steel man both positions as best as possible. So that was sort of what prompted me to start the channel.
And from maybe when we go back to where we left off, the moment that you came back to church, and the moment that you create the channel, do you know how long time passed?
Yeah, that's just 3 years.
And now that you start creating the channel, you mentioned that uh, maybe that your goal was to bridge together the good and the bad, as you mentioned, to be objective. And we see now, if we go to your YouTube page, that you have some videos on your own explaining certain criticisms or topics, and you also have guests. And you're known for having a pretty well-known guest. You got Dan Vogel, for example, you got Stephen Harper, Dan Peterson, famous critics, famous apologists. So, uh, how was it getting to contact them, and how was it to talk to them, both critics and apologists?
Yeah, most of them I just reached out to either via Facebook or got their email. It's been pretty surreal, to be honest, because with some of them I'd either read their book or listened to them on podcasts and things. And the first month of starting, it was actually really hard to get people to be willing to come on. I was getting like rejections for not hearing back. But then I was kind of surprised when I heard back from people. So Brian Hales was one of the first interviews I did on Joe Smith's polygamy, and I felt like we had a really good interview. And I think that was probably one of the first sort of big episodes that got me noticed. It got around 3,000 views, and it was really fun. I really enjoyed having those discussions because I sort of felt like there was no one for me to turn to ask a lot of the questions I had, and it's nice turning to like a scholar or a historian who at least is aware of the criticism or the question and can provide their response or their take on it, their view, even if it doesn't solve the issue. It's nice to just have someone to discuss this with, because I was keeping a lot of things bottled up inside. So it's been really surreal to get to know some of those people for the time spent with them. I'm just so humbled and privileged for their willingness to come on, because most of them like didn't take much persuasion. I would just be like, hey, I'm a member from NI. This is Northern Ireland. This is my YouTube channel. Would you like to do an episode about like the first vision? And then they're like, yeah, okay. And it's just like, do you want to know anything more about me or like my channel? And most of them have just been really willing to come on, and they've been sort of like, yeah, you can ask whatever questions. And I try to be respectful, so I don't want to engage in any debates with people, but I do want to try to ask some of the maybe tougher questions with them as well and go a little bit deeper. And it's been great that someone has been willing to spend 1, 2, 3+ hours with me. It's been great, and hopefully listeners have enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, I mean, personally speaking, it's been really helpful. When you go to, I don't know, LDS discussions or Mormon thing or Fair Mormon, and you read a quote, and then at the end you just see a name, Brian Hales or Dan Vogel. So I knew those people existed because I read their work. But now to see them, that's pretty interesting. I think that's something that your channel has done very well, is to humanize people. I think
Yeah.
that when we look at websites, podcasts, it is either I don't know, Dan Vogel, the critic of the church who hates us, and maybe Stephen Smoot,
So
the apologist who rejects history. No, so it's pretty easy to just put labels on people.
yeah,
Uh,
there's a lot of ad hominem and polarization and very much us versus them. And for the most part, almost all the guests that I've interviewed with, and I'm a pretty nice guy, so I get on with most people, but I've really liked them. And there's even some apologists, so I kind of went in with a bit of a bias against them just because of all the rhetoric against them. So for example, like Dan Peterson, I kind of went in thinking like this guy's going to be a bit of an ass, and I was like, maybe I'll grill him a little bit, and then I was like, I actually really like this guy. I'm like, he gets such a hard time, and I was like, he's really pleasant. Like I thought we had a great interview, and I think it's nice to maybe see some of the faithful scholars. I think getting not as defensive and I feel like giving like intellectually honest answers, and I'm hoping it can be a way to take away the us versus them a little bit. Of course, there's always going to be, a believing side and an unbelieving side, but less of the polarization between, critics, apologists, ex-Mormons, Mormons, because I think the reality is there's more and more people who will be leaving the church. We have to navigate relationships. And as President Nelson talked about, figure out a way to have the tough conversations without being like disrespectful or attacking towards each other, which I think has sort of been the way between critics and apologists.
Yeah, I see. And you know what? Um, I think that you mentioned that this happened to you with your audience. No, maybe that to some members, maybe you're too critical, or maybe to non-members, maybe you're
Too
ignoring
faithful.
certain things. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
did you ever uh, have experienced maybe that pushback from guests, maybe critics that said, I'm not too sure because you're a Latter-day Saint, or an apologist who said, I don't know because you talk to critics too much. Did you ever experience anything like that?
Surprisingly, actually, no. I've had one or two people who've been a bit iffy. I won't say their names, but they're apologists who they weren't too sure if my channel was more like critical at first, and they need a little bit of convincing. But no, I think for the most part, people, because I was very nervous because I did an episode with a particular critic, and I wasn't sure about releasing it. I wasn't sure how it was going to do on the channel. I wasn't sure if it was going to give the channel a bad name, like what people unsubscribe, because he was very, he's a very prominent ex-Mormon critic. Well, he's not ex-Mormon actually, but very controversial. And I was very nervous about releasing it, but for the most part, people have, I think, almost accepted that that's sort of what my channel kind of is. That I kind of want to talk to both sides. And the reason I chose to, and I'm not perfect at being objective. I think the reality is none of us are objective, but I think we strive to be fair. We strive to like represent both sides as best as we can. I think there's also been a shift in my channel as I'm going through my faith journey. I recognize that I can't stay in the middle in my faith, long term. I can always be a fair-minded person, but I've sort of known that like I'm gonna go one way or the other at some point. But I feel intellectually like with integrity, being fair-minded is something that I can keep up. Whether or not I lose my faith or keep my faith, I can always try to be fair. Whereas if I go in super apologetic and then I lose my faith, it'd be a big flip-flop to go apologetic to critical. So I sort of wanted to go in with something that I could, no matter what happens in my own faith journey, that I could keep doing it with integrity. And I feel like being fair and balanced and presenting both sides is something that I can do.
Yeah, and you know what? That's pretty interesting. That's great. Just a personal experience. A few weeks ago, I was preparing for a video for the channel, and it's about treasure digging. And so
Mm,
just looking at the different sources that we have, what we know about it, I read LDS discussions, and he talked about animal sacrifice, for example, right? That
yes, yeah.
maybe Joseph killed a dog and sprayed his blood on the circle to find the treasure. And, when you read those things, you're like, what?
Yeah, they
And,
can be quite concerning.
after what I've gone through, I learned to maybe not freak out, but maybe not to dismiss it as easily. So
Yes. Yeah.
I remember that I said, "Okay, this is weird. I never heard this before." So, okay, how can I understand it? I tried to look what people said on the positive side, um, and honestly, the only channel, the only faithful person I found who mentioned this is you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think and that's not to say that certain channels are avoiding it, but maybe some just haven't encountered it. And I think what I found with for example, the LDS discussions, I felt it was like the CS ladder, but like on steroids. It was, I think, better research and a better synthesis of criticisms. And I sort of felt that in doing this, I want to try to confront as best I can most of the issues. So I've been doing like my Book of Mormon series, and I'm getting really tired of it. Like, I've loved it. I've been trying to think of like all of the criticisms I can, and I think I've covered the majority of them. There's probably a few obscure ones, and I've got more episodes coming out as well. But yeah, I wanted to try to be comprehensive and thorough and tackle most of the hard issues and not be like, oh yeah, I know there's this issue, but I'll not do a video on that because that's too controversial, or I may not have a good answer to it. Um, but yeah, I think what you said as well is trying to confront them, not dismissing it straight away, because it's a data point, it's a source. You have to take into account and weigh up, evaluate things. But I think something that I've been trying to do is to take things slow, to try to be thorough, to try to do my research better. And at times I've just unintentionally been wrong about some things, or with more research, there's more evidence, more information on a topic. Particularly in my first couple of series, I'm not happy with my level of research. And now I'm trying to go a little bit deeper into more scholarly articles. Because I remember I did a video on, I think it was were the revivals in the 1820, and it just got tore apart on a Facebook group. And it was, I think I took a quote from like LDS discussion, CS letter, fair, maybe somewhere else, and I was like, that's fair and balanced. And someone threw at me like 100-page article on like religious excitement in Palmyra, in that surrounding area, by D. Michael Quinn, and it was all new to me. And then I read like Steve Harper's book, on Joe Smith's first vision. He had a chapter all about like religious excitement and evidence of religious camp meetings happening in the Palmyra area. And I was like, frig, I didn't even, take any of that into account. Like, this adds more to it. And it sort of made me realize that certain places, I would say both Fair has some really good answers and resources on it. Like the video that's coming out tonight is about anachronisms, and I've used Fair a lot in that. But with some topics, Fair is kind of like a starting point, and it doesn't have like all the answers, and you have to go beyond Fair and sometimes dive into like interpreter articles or BYU studies, or like other sort of, and even reading some books on topic to go a bit deeper, like digging in. And then you realize that there's actually a lot more to this topic. Like, it's kind of a cliche, but there tends to be more nuance and complexity. And you sort of realize that like what for example, say like the CS letter might present on a topic, some of the criticisms are maybe legitimate criticisms, but he can't talk about all the information on a topic, and there's often a lot more. And that's something I've realized is like going deeper, that there's a lot more nuance and complexity. I'll give you one wee example. A big issue I had with Joe Smith's first vision was early church leaders and some of his family members talking about the first vision being the angel, not the Father and the Son. And that was just always a book on my shelf. I didn't have an answer to it. I wrestled with it. The implication being that Joe Smith embellished his first vision account from the angel to the Father and the Son. And there's some quotes from people like Brigham Young, John Taylor, I think Heber C. Kimball, talking about the angel. There was one sermon, and this was, a critic had this in, I think, their book. I won't name the critic, but they had a quote from John Taylor that talked about like the beginning of the Restoration was like when the angel visited Joseph Smith, telling about the state of the religious world. And when you read that quote in isolation, you're like, okay, this supports just the angel visiting Joseph Smith, not the Father and the Son. But as I explored and looked at Farr's response in the same sermon by John Taylor, it also talked about the Father and the Son visiting Joseph. So this critic either unintentionally or intentionally omitted the fact in the same sermon John Taylor talked about the Father and the Son, because it didn't support the case they were trying to make. Likewise with other of those leaders, I found other evidence where they talked about it, and it can make things messy, but it made me realize that, okay, this kind of undermines their arguments a bit, and it made me realize that I need to do my research. I need to fact check things because you may not be getting all the evidence on a topic. And even with me, like with my videos, I try my best, but I don't want people to think that I'm covering everything there is on a topic. Like I'm just a regular guy. Like I'm a scholar. I'm not a scholar. I'm trying to do the best I can with research. I'm not intentionally wanting to hide things, which is why I try to present the critic's position fairly. But people should, do their own research as well, explore. And I think that's part of the fun of it is learning more as well. And I think that's been one of the big things I think changes I've seen from doing my channel. I think I've gone from being a consumer of content to like a seeker of knowledge. And if I listen to podcasts or if I watch YouTube videos, I do it now more with the intention to want to gain knowledge and understanding versus just consume content, but then it just go up here and not do anything with it. And I'm really trying to figure some things out.
Yeah, and I've seen that shift, and honestly, it's been pretty helpful. For example, with the sacrifice example I mentioned earlier, uh, when you talk about it in the video, you share the quote that I read in all these discussions, and I'm like, yeah, yeah, someone's talking about this. And then I was waiting for you to comment on it, but then you said, okay, so this is a quote. You can believe it or not. Let's move on now. And I was like, hey, now say something about it. I I really was interested in having and knowing your input. Uh,
Yeah.
I mean, I understand the purpose of why you mentioned the criticisms, but maybe not delve too much in your personal opinion. But it's been pretty helpful both ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think some of my early videos, I probably would like to redo some of the topics because some like I've done more work on them, so I'm thinking of like redoing maybe just like a longer episode on some of them generically. But yeah, I'm hoping that I'll be getting better with my content and interviewing people as well. And something I'm trying to do as well is because when I started my channel, I had this impression, what the Lord says in the Doctrine and Covenants, like seek you out the best books, like seek learning by study and also by faith. And I've read some books over the years, but I realized that I've not really dived heavily into a lot of like scholarly books. So, for example, uh, certain books I've been reading recently uh, for like my Book of Mormon series. So like this book by The Gift and Power by Frank Gardner about Book of Mormon translation, uh, Faith and Reason by Michael Ash, Evidences. Uh, this one, Book of Mormon is History by Brent Gardner. It's a great book. Um, Tyler Callister, Case for the Book of Mormon. Others, whenever I interviewed Stephen Harper, I was like, I need to read his book on the first vision. So I've been trying to like read a lot more books as well, to just have more knowledge. And also like if you're interviewing people, so you can at least say like, yeah, I've read your book. And that's been it's time consuming, but it's I feel like I'm the one really trying to seek answers for myself. And it takes a lot of time as well. There's not always easy, simple answers to things. But I
Yeah.
think that's been something important for me is and to want to try to go to the best scholars, the best historians on the topic. If I'm going to have a chat about polygamy, I want to talk to Brian Hales, or First Vision, let's talk to Stephen Harper, or Dan Peterson or Stephen Smoot about the Book of Mormon, like somebody who's sort of expert in it, to talk to them and try to go to the best resources, and try to find both intellectually plausible answers, as well with the spiritual, and trying to do both as well.
And recently you uploaded a video that you made with Gray Faith Area about a tier list of
Yeah,
criticisms.
yeah.
I remember that when I read the description, you mentioned that you did it a few months ago, and your opinion is different on certain topics.
Hmm.
So when you mentioned that, uh, do you mean that maybe some criticisms aren't as strong as you thought, or that some criticisms are stronger than you thought?
Um, that's a good question. I think for example with the book of Abraham, I didn't feel like I I hadn't dived deeply into it, so I knew sort of like the basic arguments with it. But I'd read a little bit more about the Book of Abraham and found that I saw some good correspondences between some ancient documents about the Book of Abraham, like the Testament of Abraham, the Apocalypse of Abraham, having a lot of the same sort of similar storylines and motifs to our Book of Abraham. And I felt that I was too negative when it came to the Book of Abraham. It was probably one of my biggest. I still think it's a huge topic and it needs to be dived into, but I felt like I maybe didn't defend that one very well because that at that time it was a huge shelf item that I hadn't dealt with yet, and I think with the Book of Mormon as well, as I've been reading a lot more about it, doing more research about it, my intellectually, I feel like the case for the Book of Mormon, although so far in my series, all the videos I've released so far have just been criticisms, but I'm going to be doing a few episodes on like a case for the Book of Mormon. And I feel like a case can be made intellectually. I feel like that's been strengthened quite a bit. For the most part, I'd say most of my views are probably similar. I think the witnesses, I was maybe a bit generous putting it in C tier because I read a book when I was on holiday investigating Book of Mormon witnesses and sort of I'm doing another video on them, my Book of Mormon series, and I feel like they're really strong. The witnesses good evidence, but for the most part, I was still happy enough to release it. But I just sort of want to make it clear that like my views are also sort of changing as time goes on.
Yeah, and I think that that's important. I think that both people who believe in the church, people who don't believe in the church, when they make the decision to stay, return, or leave, uh, their understanding of life, of God, and the gospel is also evolving, right?
Yeah, yeah.
When I chose to remain in the church, yeah, I've learned so many things, both in favor and against. So it's constantly evolving, and I think it's important to know that. And as we wrap up, both as a conclusion to part one and part two, uh, first of all, uh, how do you feel, looking back? Uh, this was maybe you talked about this earlier, but losing your faith, learning about criticisms and evidences, and going to start your channel, and talk to people from different spectrums, maybe Dan Peterson, Nemo the Mormon, and Dan Vogel, people from all spectrums, and how that's affected how you view things. So looking back,
Mm.
what's maybe the lesson in your story?
Ooh, I don't know the lesson. I think for me, I feel like with my faith crisis, well, I'm not saying that it was like part of God's plan for me to leave the church. I also feel it was kind of inevitable for me because I'm a very open-minded person. I'm a very curious person. So for people to say, don't go looking for, I never did go looking for any criticisms against the church. But as soon as I was exposed, I was like, I want to look at it all. Like, so I kind of felt for me, it was sort of inevitable that's sort of part of my personality that I was going to go through a faith crisis. And maybe it was part of my journey. Maybe there was a reason why I left the church and came back. Um, I do think that in some ways I maybe wish I had taken things a little bit slower initially, but at that time, that was the way I reacted and where I was in my faith when I first learned all those things. Um, I think looking at my channel over this past year, there's maybe some things I maybe wish I had have done a little bit differently in some ways, but for the most part, I feel like I'm pleased that I've been able to have good discussions and interviews with different guests, and for the most part, trying to build bridges and not trying to have the us versus them mentality. It's hard to do it though because at times um, you you might there's times where I felt like I've tried to be too nice or too agreeable, um, and it's hard to disagree without being disagreeable sometimes. But I think it's been good to interview different people, and for me, I think the lesson has been uh, diving in more, like diving deeply into these things don't be afraid. Like I sort of have the mentality, if the church is true, it can hold up to scrutiny. And I still believe that. I remember when I first started my channel, I had a priesthood leader who tried to advise me to stop, that if you do this, you're going to leave the church and lose your testimony. And I understood his concerns, particularly about what happened to me in the past. But I was like, I don't think telling people don't research is the answer. And I said to him, I was like, look, I'm going to be very careful. I'm going to try my best to look at the faithful scholarship equally, if not more, as the criticisms. I'm not gonna ignore the criticisms. And I also felt like I had this impression around the time I started that like I cannot keep things on a shelf anymore. Like my faith won't survive. I have to confront the books. I have to deal with these things. I may not be able to debunk every single concern, criticism. I won't be able to find evidence that proves it, but I need to find some plausible answers to align the intellectual and the spiritual. And I told him that I'm gonna have to confront these things, but I'm gonna try to go to the best books. I want to read the best scholarship and see if I can find answers for myself. Um, I think what I've learned is that often there's usually two sides to an issue. There's more nuance and complexity. Sometimes, I'm not saying that the critics are misleading. I think there's some valid issues and criticisms in our history and with the church, but sometimes things can be simplified when there's more to it. There's like another side, and I'd also say to keep include God in the journey, which is what I've been trying to do. And this year, as I've been doing my series on the Book of Mormon, I realized that I need to read the Book of Mormon again. I've been reading it, and I've been getting a lot more out of it, both in a devotional sense, but as I'm reading, for example, the book by Brent Gardner on the Book of Mormon, his history, and some of the things he's pointing to that connect Mesoamerican culture, Mayan culture, and the Book of Mormon. Then you read it and you're like, oh, I can see it. That's really cool. Or all the internal consistent geography and the complexity. And so in some ways it's made it more meaningful, and how, the intellectual and the spiritual, faith and reason can go together. So I don't know if that answered the question.
No, no, yeah, it did. When you um are in this, part of your faith journey that's ongoing, I think that you can, well, you have a lot of experience to share, both uh with your channel's content and with advice. And I think the last question will be just that. What would your advice be for people who are learning about criticisms for the first time? Maybe they don't know how to feel about it, or people who have heard maybe a simplistic overview of criticisms and don't know what to think. What would your advice be on how to tackle that and how to implement both intellectual and spiritual research?
That's a really good question. No pressure on me. I think, yeah, like the first thing is just I would empathize and validate. Like I get it. I I was there. I know how it feels. You're in faith crisis. You feel betrayed, and you feel like you can't reconcile a lot of those things. I think if I were to give some advice, some practical advice, it would be to try to speak to someone who's either been in a faith crisis or a trusted leader, someone you can trust or someone who's maybe informed, and talk to them about your concerns. I would tell them, and it can be hard depending on what state you're in, but to avoid critically attacking and accusing, but asking questions with an open mind as well. Because I think how you ask questions as well is important. Because you can get to the stage. What happened with me is whenever I lost my faith, when I would throw questions at people, it wasn't because I wanted them to really answer. I wanted to throw at them a tough criticism that I knew they wouldn't have a good response because I wanted to outsmart them. So to ask sincere questions, I would say try to go intellectually to the best resources. I think there's some good YouTube channels out there if you're into that. LDS Truth Claims, Latter-day Saints Q&A, some of the Fair Mormon conferences, Saints Unscripted, I think are great. Try to go to the best books, seek out the best scholars, read their books, and try to dive deeper into the research. If you've read something like the CS letter or letter from my wife, um, that's fine. Research the critical topic, but give as much attention to the faithful side. Give it a fair shot as well before you jump ship, especially if you feel like you've had spiritual experiences. And I would also include God in your faith crisis. I don't think he's mad with you because you're struggling with doubts. This is just part of your journey, and to include the spiritual element, to be open to answers to prayer, and that hopefully God can guide you through it, and that you can come to whatever conclusion and make the decision you feel like right for your life. It may not be the same as me, but to stay open-minded and to keep searching, spiritually and intellectually.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for sharing that. Thank
Thank
you
you.
for sharing your story, your faith journey, and your channel. I think it'll be a great if to my viewers, if anyone speaks English or if they can add automatic subtitles, I greatly recommend it. So, before we finish, do you have any last words or anything you would like to share?
No, I don't think so. I've really enjoyed this opportunity to share my story. Hopefully it's been beneficial, and yeah, people can, if they're interested, check out my channel, Mormonism with the Murph. And yeah, hopefully enjoy some of the content I'm producing. I'm near the end of my Book of Mormon series, and I'm excited for the next few interviews and also episodes I have coming out. So I think there's hopefully good content coming.